Guadalcanal, October 1942. In the wet dark of the jungle night, Private First Class Eugene Martinez pressed his back against the twisted roots of a banyan tree and tried not to think about the fact that his Browning automatic rifle was loaded with ammunition that could turn the entire ridgeline into an inferno. The M1918A2 bar weighed 19.5 pounds, but tonight it felt heavier, because tucked into the 20-round magazine were not the standard .30-06 Springfield rounds he had trained with at Camp Pendleton, but something the quartermasters had handed out with strict instructions and wide, nervous eyes. 4 tracer rounds alternating with 16 incendiary rounds. The incendiaries were M1 rounds, designed originally for aircraft use, each one tipped with a small charge of phosphorus and magnesium compound that ignited on impact. In the air, they were meant to pierce fuel tanks and set bombers ablaze. On the ground, in a jungle soaked with humidity but layered with dry palm fronds, tangled vines, and oil-rich vegetation, they were about to become something the Japanese had no doctrine for, no countermeasure against, and no name for except the one that would spread in terrified whispers through their lines over the next 2 years. They called it Kaji no Karikari, Fire Reaper. If this story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like these. Martinez was 22 years old, born in a small farming town outside Salinas, California, where his family worked the lettuce fields and his father spoke more Spanish than English. Eugene had joined the Marines in early 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, not out of patriotism or adventure, but because the pay was steady and his mother needed the allotment checks. He was a quiet kid, methodical, not particularly aggressive, but he had good hands and excellent eyesight. At boot camp on Paris Island, his drill instructors noted that he could field strip a rifle faster than most men could load one, and when they handed him a bar during advanced infantry training, he took to it with the kind of natural ease some men have with machines. The bar was not an easy weapon to love. It was heavy. It overheated quickly. It chewed through ammunition at a cyclic rate of 550 rounds per minute on full auto, and if you were not careful with your burst, you could empty a magazine in under 3 seconds and find yourself holding an expensive club. But Martinez learned its rhythm. He learned to fire in short, controlled bursts of 3 to 5 rounds. He learned to change magazines in under 4 seconds. He learned to keep the gas regulator clean and to never, ever let the barrel overheat to the point where the rifling warped. By the time his unit, 1st Battalion, 7 Marines, shipped out to the South Pacific in August 1942, Martinez was the best barman in his company and possibly in the regiment. Guadalcanal was a different kind of hell than anything the training manuals had prepared them for. The island was 100 miles long, covered in dense jungle, razor-edged kanai grass, and mountains that rose over 7,000 feet. The heat was crushing, a wet, suffocating blanket that never lifted. Even at night, malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever swept through the American lines as efficiently as Japanese bullets. The enemy held a high ground, dug into reinforced bunkers and spider holes that were invisible until you were standing on top of them. The Japanese soldiers fought with fanaticism that unnerved even the most hardened Marines. They did not retreat. They did not surrender. They charged with bayonets fixed, screaming, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes in broad daylight, wave after wave, until the jungle floor was slick with blood and the smell of death hung in the air like smoke. The Marines called these attacks banzai charges, and they were terrifying not because they were tactically sound, which they were not, but because they kept coming, no matter how many men fell. By mid-October, the Americans controlled Henderson Field, the critical airstrip near the northern coast, but barely. The Japanese were bringing in reinforcements by night. Fast destroyers racing down a supply route the Marines bitterly nicknamed the Tokyo Express. The perimeter around the airfield was under constant pressure. Patrols clashed in the jungle daily. Snipers tied themselves into treetops and waited for hours to take a single shot. Mortars dropped from the ridges without warning. And at night, the Japanese probed the Marine lines, testing for weak points, sometimes launching full-scale assault designed to overrun positions before reinforcements could arrive. It was during one of these night battles that the idea of using incendiary ammunition in the bar was born, not from some tactical genius at division headquarters, but from a desperate company commander who had watched 3 consecutive defensive positions get overrun because his men could not see what they were shooting at in the pitch-black jungle. Captain Raymond Calhoun was a 31-year-old career officer from Tennessee, a man with a thick drawl and a reputation for unconventional thinking. He had been a Marine since 1933, had served in China and Nicaragua, and had seen enough combat to know that doctrine was useful right up until the moment it got you killed. Calhoun's company had been assigned to hold a section of ridgeline 2 miles south of Henderson Field, a position that overlooked a narrow valley the Japanese used as an approach route. The ridge was not particularly high, maybe 300 feet, but was steep, covered in jungle, and offered excellent fields of fire if you could see anything, which at night you could not. Standard procedure was to set up interlocking fields of fire with machine guns, rifles, and bars, dig in, string barbed wire if you had it, set up trip flares, and wait. The problem was that trip flares only worked if the enemy triggered them, and the Japanese had gotten very good at bypassing them or cutting the wires. The problem was that machine gun tracers gave away your position. The problem was in the jungle at night. You could hear the enemy moving, hear them whispering, hear the rustle of vegetation, but you could not see them until they were close enough to throw grenades or rush your foxhole with bayonet. Calhoun had lost 11 men in 2 nights. Not the banzai charges, but the slow, methodical infiltration. Small groups of Japanese soldiers creeping through the jungle, getting within 15 or 20 yards of Marine positions, then opening fire with rifles and light machine guns. By the time the Marines returned fire, the Japanese had already moved. By the time reinforcements arrived, the enemy had faded back into the jungle. It was a brutal, exhausting kind of warfare, and it was working. Calhoun knew that if he did not find a way to change the dynamic, his company would be bled dry within a week. So he went to the battalion supply officer, a nervous lieutenant named Harmon, who had never been in combat, and whose job consisted mostly of trying to distribute insufficient quantities of ammunition, rations, and medical supplies among too many men. Calhoun asked Harmon if there was any ordnance available that could be used to light up the jungle, something that would let his men see what they were shooting at without giving away their own positions. Harmon thought for a moment, then mentioned that a shipment of aircraft ammunition had arrived the previous week, including several crates of M1 incendiary rounds intended for .30 caliber machine guns on P-39 Airacobra fighters. The incendiary rounds were not standard infantry issue. They were designed to ignite fuel, wood, and fabric, and they worked by combining a small incendiary charge with a hardened steel penetrator. On impact, the charge ignited, burning at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit for several seconds. In the air, this was enough to set an aircraft on fire. On the ground, Calhoun realized it might be enough to set the jungle itself on fire. He asked Harmon if the rounds would chamber in a bar. Harmon checked the specifications. They were .30-06 Springfield, same as standard infantry rounds. They would chamber. Calhoun took 600 rounds, had his armorers load them into bar magazines, alternating 4 tracers with 16 incendiaries, and distributed them to his automatic riflemen with instructions to use them only on his direct order. He did not clear this with battalion. He did not file paperwork. He did not ask permission. He simply did it, because in his judgment, the situation required it, and if it worked, no one would complain, and if it did not work, he would be dead anyway and it would not matter. On the night of October 14, 1942, the Japanese launched another probing attack against Calhoun's position. It began just after midnight. The moon was a thin crescent, barely visible through the jungle canopy. The air was thick, still, heavy with the smell of rotting vegetation and latrine pits. Martinez was positioned near the center of the line, crouched in a shallow fighting hole he had dug that afternoon, the bar resting on a sandbag, barrel angled down the slope toward the valley. He had 3 magazines loaded with the new ammunition, each one marked with a strip of white medical tape, so he would not confuse them with standard rounds. He did not know exactly what the incendiary rounds would do. He had been told they would burn. He had been told to aim low into the vegetation, not at individual targets. He had been told that once he started firing, he should keep firing until ordered to stop, because the goal was not to kill individual soldiers, but to ignite the entire approach route and force the enemy into the open. The first sign of the attack was the sound of movement. Faint, rhythmic, maybe 100 yards down the slope. Then a whistle, short and sharp, a signal. Then the crack of rifle fire, close, too close. Muzzle flashes flickering in the dark like fireflies. Marines along the line returned fire. The sharp reports of M1 Garand's and a heavier thud of the bar in standard configuration. Calhoun, positioned 10 yards to Martinez's left, yelled for the incendiaries. Martinez flipped the fire selector to full auto, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The bar roared, the recoil punching into his shoulder in a steady, brutal rhythm. The first round were tracers, red streaks that arced down the slope and disappeared into the vegetation. Then the incendiaries hit. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The jungle erupted in flames. Not a single fire, but dozens of small, intense blazes that spread with shocking speed. Dry palm fronds ignited like gasoline. Vines curled and blackened. The underbrush, layered with months of dead leaves and rotting wood, caught fire and began to burn with a thick, choking smoke. The incendiary rounds did not just ignite on impact. They burned through, punching into the ground, into tree trunks, into the thick matted vegetation, and each one started a new fire. Within 30 seconds, the entire slope below Martinez's position was ablaze. The Japanese soldiers caught in the open had no chance. Some tried to retreat, stumbling back through the flames, their uniforms catching fire. Some tried to advance, running uphill through the smoke, only to be cut down by rifle fire from Marines who could now see them clearly, silhouetted against the flames. Some dropped to the ground and tried to crawl, but the fire spread faster than they could move. The screams were terrible, high-pitched and desperate, the sound of men burning alive. Martinez kept firing. He emptied the first magazine, reloaded, fired again. The bar bucked in his hands, the barrel heating rapidly, the gas regulator hissing. He could feel the heat from the fires below, could smell burning flesh and hair, could see shapes moving in the flames, writhing, collapsing. He kept firing because Calhoun was yelling at him to keep firing, because the doctrine was to maintain suppressive fire, because stopping would mean giving the enemy a chance to regroup. He emptied the second magazine, reloaded, fired the third. By the time Calhoun ordered a ceasefire, the slope was blackened, smoking ruin. The fires were still burning, but the attack had stopped. The Japanese had withdrawn. The Marines counted 19 enemy bodies the next morning, most of them burned beyond recognition. Calhoun's company suffered 0 casualties. Word of the incendiary bar spread quickly. Within a week, every automatic rifleman in 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, was issued incendiary rounds. Within 2 weeks, the practice had spread to other battalions. Within a month, it was standard procedure across the 1st Marine Division. The results were consistent and devastating. Japanese units that had been using the jungle as cover, that had been infiltrating Marine positions under the cover of darkness, suddenly found themselves trapped in a landscape that could turn into a firestorm with a single burst of automatic fire. The psychological effect was as significant as the tactical one. Japanese soldiers began to avoid dense vegetation, began to move more cautiously, began to fear the sound of the bar in a way they had not before. American intelligence officers intercepted radio transmissions in which Japanese commanders complained about a new American weapon, something that set the jungle on fire, something that made defensive positions untenable. They called it Kaji no Karikari, Fire Reaper, and the name stuck. Marines began to hear from prisoners, from captured documents, from Japanese soldiers yelling warnings to each other during firefights. The name was not official. It did not appear in any American after-action reports. But it was real and it was feared. If you want the next part, subscribe now. The tactical impact of incendiary ammunition in the bar went far beyond simply lighting fires. It fundamentally changed the way infantry combat was conducted in the Pacific Theater. Before incendiaries, the jungle was an advantage for the defender. Dense vegetation provided concealment, made it difficult to call on artillery or air support, and allowed small units to ambush larger forces with relative impunity. After incendiaries, the jungle became a liability. A single barman could deny an entire approach route. A two-man team, one with a standard bar and one with incendiaries, could establish a defensive position that was nearly impossible to assault without taking catastrophic casualties. The Japanese had no effective counter. Water did not help. The fires spread too quickly. Smoke grenades did not help. The flames produced their own smoke. Trying to suppress the barman did not help. He was usually dug in, and by the time you located his position, the jungle around you was already burning. The only effective response was to avoid the area entirely, which meant ceding terrain, which meant losing the initiative. The use of incendiary ammunition was not without controversy. Some officers argued that it violated the laws of war, that deliberately setting fire to vegetation with the intent of burning enemy soldiers alive was inhumane. Others pointed out that the Japanese were not signatories to the Geneva Conventions, that they had committed atrocities against prisoners and civilians, and that in any case, the incendiaries were not being used against personnel directly, but against cover and concealment. The debate never reached a formal resolution because by the time it reached higher headquarters, the practice was already widespread and effective, and no commanding officer was willing to order his men to stop using a weapon that was saving lives. The official position, articulated in a terse memo from division headquarters in December 1942, was that incendiary ammunition was authorized for use against fortified positions and vegetation that provided cover to enemy forces, and that its use should be consistent with the tactical situation and the judgment of the officer in command. In practice, this meant that Marines used incendiaries whenever and wherever they thought it would help, and no one stopped them. Martinez continued to serve as a barman through the Guadalcanal campaign, and into the next year, he fought at Cape Gloucester, at Peleliu, and finally at Okinawa, where he was wounded in the leg by shrapnel from a mortar round and evacuated to a hospital ship. He survived the war, returned to California, married, had 3 children, and worked for 30 years as a mechanic in a cannery outside Salinas. He rarely spoke about the war. When he did, he talked about the men he had served with, the friends he had lost, the fear and exhaustion, and long stretches of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. He did not talk about the night he first used incendiary rounds, about the fires, about the screams. He did not talk about the fact that he had burned men alive. He did not need to. The war had been full of terrible things, and that was just one of them. He kept his bar manuals, his service records, and a faded photograph of his squad taken on Guadalcanal in November 1942. In the photo, he is standing in the back row, thin and young, holding his bar with the barrel pointed skyward. He is not smiling. None of them are. The tactical evolution of the incendiary bar did not stop with Guadalcanal. As the war progressed and American forces pushed further into the Pacific, the use of incendiary ammunition became more sophisticated and more integrated into standard infantry doctrine. By 1943, Marine and Army units were experimenting with different loading patterns, different types of incendiary compounds, and different tactical applications. Some units loaded their bar magazines with a higher ratio of incendiaries to tracers, sacrificing some visibility for increased fire-starting potential. Some units used incendiaries not as a defensive tool, but as an offensive one, advancing behind a wall of flame to clear enemy bunkers and spider holes. Some units combined incendiary bars with flamethrowers and satchel charges in coordinated assaults designed to systematically destroy fortified positions. The Japanese, for their part, adapted as best they could. They began to clear vegetation around their defensive positions, creating fire breaks. They began to dig deeper, to reinforce their bunkers with earth and logs, to position their fighting holes in areas where the terrain made fire less likely to spread. But these adaptations were only partially effective, and they came at a cost. Clearing vegetation made positions more visible to American artillery and airstrikes. Digging deeper took time and resources, and no amount of preparation could fully counter the psychological impact of watching the jungle around you erupt in flames. One of the most effective uses of incendiary bars came during the Battle of Bougainville in November 1943. American forces landed on the island's western coast with the objective of establishing a defensive perimeter and building airfields from which to support operations further north. The Japanese, holding the high ground inland, launched a series of counterattacks designed to push the Americans back into the sea. The fighting was brutal and sustained, with Japanese forces attacking in waves, often at night, often through dense jungle. Marine units defending the perimeter used incendiary bars to create barriers of fire along likely approach routes. forcing Japanese soldiers into kill zones covered by machine guns and mortars. The tactic was devastatingly effective. Japanese casualties in some sectors exceeded 70%. American casualties, by contrast, were relatively light. One Marine captain, writing in his after-action report, noted that the incendiary bar had effectively turned a jungle from an enemy asset into an American weapon, and that without it, the defensive perimeter would likely have been breached. The technical challenges of using incendiary ammunition in the bar were significant and required constant attention from armors and infantrymen alike. The primary issue was heat. The bar was designed to fire standard .30-06 Springfield rounds at a cyclic rate of 550 rounds per minute in full automatic mode. Incendiary rounds burned hotter than standard rounds, both in the chamber and after leaving the barrel, and sustained fire could cause the barrel to overheat to the point of warping. An overheated barrel lost accuracy, increased the risk of a cook-off, which is when a round ignites in the chamber due to residual heat before the trigger is pulled, and could ultimately render the weapon inoperable. To mitigate this, bar men were trained to fire in shorter bursts when using incendiaries, typically 3 to 5 rounds, and to change barrels more frequently if spare barrels were available, which they often were not. Another issue was fouling. The incendiary compound left a residue in the chamber and barrel that was more difficult to clean than standard powder residue. If not properly maintained, this residue could cause feeding problems, misfires, and reduce muzzle velocity. Bar men learned to clean their weapons obsessively, often multiple times a day, using whatever solvents and brushes they could scrounge. There was also the issue of supply. Incendiary rounds were not produced in the same quantities as standard ammunition, and they were not always available when and where they were needed. Units that had grown to rely on incendiaries often found themselves rationing rounds, saving them for critical moments, or scrounging from other units. This created a black market of sorts, with bar men trading cigarettes, rations, and other contraband for incendiary rounds. Some men hoarded them, keeping extra magazines hidden in their packs or buried near their foxholes. Some men became expert at identifying which supply sergeants were most likely to have incendiaries and most likely to be bribed or persuaded to part with them. The scarcity of incendiary ammunition also meant that its use was often a command decision. A platoon leader might decide that only 1 or 2 bar men in his unit would carry incendiaries, with the rest carrying standard loads, and that the incendiaries would only be used in specific tactical situations, such as defending a perimeter at night or clearing a heavily vegetated approach route. This required discipline and coordination, and it required bar men to be able to switch between standard and incendiary loads quickly and efficiently. The psychological impact of the incendiary bar on Japanese soldiers cannot be overstated. Fire is a primal fear, and the experience of being caught in a firestorm, of watching the jungle around you ignite, of feeling the heat and smoke, and knowing that you have nowhere to run, is a level of terror that few men can endure. Japanese soldiers who survived encounters with incendiary bars often described them in terms that went beyond tactical assessment. They spoke of demons, of hellfire, of a weapon that did not just kill but consumed. This fear was not irrational. The fires started by incendiary rounds spread quickly and unpredictably. They created smoke that choked and blinded. They created heat that was unbearable. They created a battlefield environment in which the only rational response was to flee, and fleeing often meant exposing yourself to rifle fire. The psychological effect extended beyond individual soldiers. Japanese commanders, aware that their men feared the incendiary bar, began to avoid terrain where it might be used. They began to plan attacks along routes that minimized exposure to dense vegetation. They began to issue orders that emphasized speed and aggression, hoping to close with American positions before the fires could be set. But speed and aggression played into American strengths, which were superior firepower in defensive positions, and the result was often the same: high Japanese casualties and failed attacks. One of the most detailed accounts of the incendiary bar's effectiveness comes from a Japanese officer named Lieutenant Hiroshi Takeda, who served with the 38th Infantry Division on New Guinea in 1944. Takeda survived the war and was later interviewed by American military historians as part of a project to document Japanese perspectives on the Pacific War. In his interview, Takeda described an attack his company launched against an American position near Atape in July 1944. The position was held by elements of the 32nd Infantry Division, and it was dug along a low ridge overlooking a swampy valley filled with dense jungle. Takeda's company was ordered to advance through the valley, cross the swamp, and assault the ridge. They moved at night, hoping to avoid American artillery and air strikes. The advance was slow and difficult. The swamp was deeper than expected. The mud was thick and clinging, and the vegetation was so dense that visibility was limited to a few yards. Takeda's men moved in single file, following narrow trails, trying to stay quiet. They were within 50 yards of the American position when the firing started. Takeda described the bar fire as unlike anything he had experienced before. The first bursts were tracers, red lines cutting through the darkness. Then the jungle exploded in flames. The fire started low at ground level and spread upward and outward with terrifying speed. Within seconds, the entire approach route was burning. Takeda's men panicked. Some tried to advance through the flames, screaming, their uniforms catching fire. Some tried to retreat, stumbling back through the swamp, dropping their rifles and equipment. Some dropped to the ground and tried to crawl, but the fire was everywhere, in the trees, in the undergrowth, in the air itself. Takeda ordered retreat, but the order was unnecessary. His men were already running. Of the 80 men who had started the attack, 37 did not make it back. Some burned to death. Some drowned in the swamp trying to escape. Some were shot by American riflemen as they fled. Takeda himself was wounded, a bullet through his shoulder, but he survived. In his interview, he said that the experience had broken something in his men, that after that night, they were no longer willing to advance through jungle terrain if there was any possibility of encountering the Fire Reaper. He said that the weapon had a reputation among Japanese soldiers that went beyond its actual lethality, that men feared it more than they feared artillery, more than they feared tanks, because it turned the jungle itself into an enemy. The American military's formal recognition of the incendiary bar's effectiveness came in the form of updated training manuals and tactical directives issued in late 1943 and early 1944. Field Manual 23-15, the official manual for the Browning automatic rifle, was revised to include a section on the use of incendiary ammunition. The section was brief, only 3 pages, but it was explicit. It stated that incendiary ammunition was authorized for use in the bar and that it was particularly effective in jungle terrain, where vegetation provided cover and concealment to enemy forces. It provided guidance on loading patterns, recommending a ratio of 4 tracers to 16 incendiaries for optimal effect. It provided guidance on target selection, recommending that incendiary fire be directed at vegetation rather than individual personnel, with the goal of igniting fires that would force the enemy into the open or deny terrain. It provided guidance on safety, warning that incendiary rounds generated more heat than standard rounds and that sustained fire could damage the weapon. And it provided guidance on command and control, recommending that the use of incendiary ammunition be coordinated with other supporting fires, and that commanders be prepared for the rapid spread of fires in dry conditions. The updated manual was distributed to all infantry units in the Pacific, and it was incorporated into training programs at bases in the United States and Australia. New recruits were taught not just how to fire the bar, but how to fire with incendiary ammunition, how to manage the heat, how to select targets, how to coordinate with other weapons. The incendiary bar became a standard part of the American infantry arsenal, as common and as expected as the M1 Garand or the M1919 machine gun. And yet, despite its widespread use, it remained a weapon that was not widely known outside of the infantry. Journalists who covered the Pacific War rarely mentioned it. Photographers rarely captured it. The official histories, written after the war, mention incendiary ammunition only in passing, as one of many innovations that contributed to American success. The men who used it, men like Martinez, rarely spoke about it. And so the incendiary bar, the weapon the Japanese called Fire Reaper, became one of the war's quiet secrets, known to those who fought and feared it, but largely forgotten by history. The legacy of the incendiary bar extends beyond World War II. The concept of using incendiary ammunition and automatic weapons to deny terrain and force enemy movement influenced post-war infantry tactics and weapons development. During the Korean War, American forces used similar tactics, employing incendiary rounds of machine guns and automatic rifles to clear vegetation and destroy enemy positions. During the Vietnam War, the practice evolved further with the introduction of white phosphorus rounds and other incendiary munitions designed for use in jungle and urban environments. The M202 Flash, a 4-tube rocket launcher that fired incendiary rockets, was a direct descendant of the incendiary bar concept, designed to create walls of fire that could clear bunkers and spider holes. The modern U.S. military continues to use incendiary munitions in various forms, from incendiary grenades to thermobaric weapons, all of which trace their lineage back to the improvised solutions developed by men like Captain Calhoun and used by men like Eugene Martinez on the ridges of Guadalcanal in 1942. The ethical and legal questions surrounding the use of incendiary weapons have persisted as well. International humanitarian law, as codified in the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, restricts the use of incendiary weapons against civilian populations and civilian objects, but does not prohibit their use against military targets. Protocol 3 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, adopted in 1980, specifically addresses incendiary weapons, defining them as weapons primarily designed to set fire to objects or to cause burn injured persons, and prohibits their use against civilians or in civilian areas. However, the protocol allows for the use of incendiary weapons against military objectives, including personnel, equipment, and facilities, provided that such use is consistent with the principles of distinction and proportionality. The United States is a signatory to Protocol 3, but with reservations that allow for the use of incendiary weapons in self-defense and in situations where military necessity requires it. The debate over the morality and legality of incendiary weapons continues, particularly in the context of modern conflicts where the line between combatants and civilians is often blurred, but the historical precedent established during World War II remains a foundational reference point. Eugene Martinez died in 1998 at the age of 78. His obituary in the Salinas newspaper mentioned his service in the Marine Corps, his 3 children, his 6 grandchildren, and his long career at the cannery. It did not mention the night he first used incendiary rounds, or the fires, or the screams, or the fact that he had been part of a small, brutal innovation that changed the course of jungle warfare in the Pacific. His family donated his service records and personal effects to the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia, where they are stored in a climate-controlled archive along with thousands of other collections from thousands of other Marines. His bar, the actual weapon he carried on Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester and Peleliu, was lost somewhere in the Pacific, turned into a supply depot after he was wounded, probably melted down for scrap after the war. But the legacy of what he did, of what he and men like him did, remains. It remains in the training manuals, in the after-action reports, in the intercepted radio transmissions that speak of Fire Reaper. It remains in the memories of men who fought alongside him and the men who fought against him. And it remains in the quiet, unspoken knowledge that war is not just about tactics and technology, but about the ordinary men who, when faced with impossible situations, find ways to survive, to fight, and to win, even if those ways are terrible and even if history forgets their names. The incendiary bar was not a weapon that won the war. No single weapon wins a war. But it was a weapon that changed the terms of engagement in a specific theater at a specific time in a specific way. It turned the jungle from an asset into a liability for the Japanese. It gave American infantry a tool to deny terrain, to break up attacks, to force enemy movement into kill zones. It created a psychological effect that went beyond its physical lethality, a fear that spread through Japanese ranks and influenced their tactics and morale. And it did all of this not because of some brilliant innovation by a weapons engineer or a strategic planner, but because a company commander on Guadalcanal, facing a desperate situation, improvised a solution using materials at hand. And because the men under his command, men like Eugene Martinez, executed that solution with discipline and courage. That is the real story of the incendiary bar. It is not a story about technology or doctrine. It is a story about adaptability, about resourcefulness, about ordinary men doing extraordinary things under extraordinary pressure. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, even if the men who lived it chose not to speak of it. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together.